Hello, everyone. I just want to give a kind of like a brief, intuitive explanation for the symmetry theory of valence and why it makes sense. I do get asked a lot, like, hey, it's interesting that you're developing, precise, empirically testable predictions based on philosophy, but why symmetry? Why does symmetry have anything to do with pleasure and pain? It's not necessarily intuitive at first. And the first time the idea was suggested to me by Mike Johnson, it also, I thought it didn't quite necessarily have the necessary grounding for me to believe in it. But over the years, after kind of applying it on a wide range of situations, I think it has aged really well. And let me just give you a few examples. So first of all, a completely intuitive understanding. So imagine you're like in a very stressed out situation and you're very irritated and you're not necessarily feeling the best either emotionally or physically or spiritually or whatnot. But then like a very friendly massage therapist or maybe your significant other starts massaging your arm in a very kind of a regular and pleasant way. And if you introspect in that, in a sense, the rest of your body might be kind of messed up in one way or another. But because you have that harmonious stimulation in your left arm, you're able to rest your attention there. And I think this is kind of really critical, this idea that when there's a pleasant sensation in your experiential field, you're able to rest your attention there. And here's where it really comes out relevant to talk about like the three types of valences that there are when it comes to sensations that we get. So we have pleasant, positive valence, which might be kind of this harmonious stimulation. Neutral, which might be kind of a white noise or brown noise, but basically something that looks like it has a almost kind of a continuous spectrum. It doesn't have these sharp, pure tones. And something like, if you're very stressed out, listening to that could actually be relaxing and peaceful because kind of like takes your mind off of the unpleasantness of your sensations. But if you're trying to listen to a symphony, it might not be the best situation. You actually would prefer to have like silence rather than a white noise machine if you're trying to pay attention to some pleasant sensations. And unpleasant sensations, you can think of them largely as, in some sense, symmetry breaking operations. But I mean, really that cashes out, especially when you take into account the time arrow in your experience. It cashes out in the form of jittering your attention. So compare, having a very pleasant, massage on the left of your, the left arm, and maybe like really terrible pain. You got burnt or something like that on the right arm. And the resulting experience is going to be what we call a mixed experience, right? It's going to have pleasant sensations and unpleasant sensations. And, it's definitely the case that a lot of people are concerned with this idea of like trying to reduce valence to just one dimension. But consider that example, right? Like, sure, you're burned here, you're experiencing some pleasant harmonious pattern over here. And there's really kind of like a threshold of which of these two is more intense, where you're able to, so to speak, rest your attention more than 50% of your time in these like nice repeating pattern, as opposed to being violently jittered into these other unpleasant, irregular or like stinging or pinching or, stretching or whatever other symmetry breaking operation may be going on in the pain. But there's kind of a threshold in which more than half of your time you're spending peacefully resting your attention versus being jittered into this kind of restless state. So in that sense, there is a global valence score for your overall experience, even though structurally it may have a lot of detail, it may have a lot of complications. It's not straightforward to say it was just pure bliss or it was pure pain. Even though it's mixed, there's still this kind of overall, were you able to rest your attention peacefully or not? And I think like that's kind of like really a good mark for, are you above the hedonic zero, so to speak. Now, this doesn't only show up, in this very clear example of massaging versus experiencing pain. It appears all over the place. I mean, consider like how, in a sense, dreaming can intensify the experience of music. I mean, there's this article I wrote about like dream music and how a lot of self-reported experiences, personal, but also all over the internet, people saying, I was able to experience the most beautiful music when I was dreaming, maybe lucid dreaming or during a sleep paralysis, for example. And the thing is, when you are actually in that situation and you introspect on what is it that is making the sound so special, is not actually the melody, although the melody could be really interesting, and it's fascinating that we have a real-time generator for possible new melodies. That's, of course, it's fascinating, but it's really more about the quality of the sound. That when you're in these very interesting sleep paralysis or lucid dream hallucinating music, is the resonant quality of the music. It's almost like mesmerizing or hypnotizing, and that's really where the valence is concentrated. It's not actually the melody. And in fact, this kind of insight can be applied also for music in everyday life to a large extent. The melody is kind of important to trick the brain in order to pay full attention to it. You can explain it in terms of something like predictive coding or the free energy principle. You need some kind of threshold for surprise to actually get the brain to really take the sounds as seriously. But once you cross it, is really more the resonant, echoey quality of the sound that will kind of account for the largest piece of the variance for how good or unpleasant the sound feels like. And again, you have these, three possible valences. You have the overall is the collection of sounds that you're hearing, a type of collection of sounds where more than 50% of your time you can pay attention in a peaceful way to concentrate your attention into it, or is it jittering your attention, like these like terribly dissonant sounds like that some people play with in music, or is it neither somewhere where you can rest your attention peacefully, or jittering and is more kind of a, you might call kind of a generic non-informative sound like, white noise or something like that. So that would be a neutral valence. Now, here, what is symmetrical or anti-symmetrical about all of these? Well, that happens in the arrow of time, that your experience contains, in a sense, the arrow of time encoding information about the last few seconds into kind of an instantaneous experience where it feels like time is passing. And we found, partly through examining many people's experiences, but also with some psychophysics experiments we've developed, that the bulk of valence tends to be concentrated in that pseudo-time arrow, like the subjective sensation of time passing, and is the regular patterning in that arrow that determines, in a sense, how good or bad you feel. We can kind of like bring this to the realm of physiology. It's fascinating. There's all this talk about heart rate variability as kind of like a metric for well-being, and in a sense, there's quite a bit in there. And if you introspect about when you're anxious, you will realize that there's all of these prediction errors that is going on in your body. You will feel kind of a heartbeat out of step, or breathing is off, and I think like that is really part of the course when it comes to unpleasant sensations or unpleasant states of consciousness. That in a sense there's going to be 99 times out of 100 some kind of dysregulation in the time arrow, where there's going to be some irregular patterning along it. But we could definitely extend this to any other area that produces intensely valenced states. I mean, meditation. It's fascinating that if you achieve what's called the jhanas in Buddhism, they're extremely concentrated states of consciousness. And in some sense, they're extremely simple, which is to a large extent a signature of symmetry. Especially when you go to not the first four, which kind of like involve a concentration object, but when you go to the formless ones, right? Like why would, concentration into space itself with no content, why would that be a valence experience? Why would that feel great and peaceful and fantastic if the information content had nothing to do with the experience, with the quality of the experience? And as you progress even further on the jhanas, the experience of concentrating on consciousness itself, and then concentrating on concentrating on nothing, and then concentrating on nothing, neither nothing nor something. Now, I would like to kind of like add that I don't think that in a sense, you're achieving the seventh jhana when you're concentrating on nothing. It doesn't mean you don't exist. It might just mean that your field of awareness, where the awareness is pushing your attention to go, basically might create a kind of smooth manifold where the attention doesn't get concentrated into a particular point and instead kind of continues to move on and on in an infinite loop. Now, in that state, because you're not ever actually focusing on something, it may feel like you're not experiencing anything. That said, you will continue to have a structure. The structure of your experience will itself, in a sense, give rise to the sensation of focusing on nothing, but at the same time, it has a particular shape. And in this theory, that shape would be extremely smooth and symmetrical. And that's why it feels so great to be on a jhana state. We can also talk about, for example, sexual experiences, how orgasm has these peculiar kind of resonant, almost fully thought-interrupting quality of overwhelming resonance throughout your body and especially your sexual organs, just very intense resonance there. Again, it doesn't make sense that would have a particular valence unless symmetry was somehow connected to it. There's also different psychoactive substances. I mean, there's this study we conducted, conducting factor analysis on people's descriptions of different drugs. And, there seems to be three kinds of euphoria. There is a slow euphoria, such as like alcohol or sedatives. And then there's fast euphoria, like stimulants. And then there's like this other thing that, we called it at the times spiritual/philosophical euphoria. But perhaps today we might want to talk about it as self-organizing criticality euphoria or something like that, basically pushing the brain to a critical state. And in each of those types of euphoria, there is also an account of how that is connected to symmetry. Because in the slow euphoria, in a sense, is kind of these low-frequency resonant modes that involve your entire body. The heroin buzz, so to speak, involves your entire body and very deep states of relaxation. Whereas stimulants, especially euphoric stimulants, we may interpret them as high-frequency symmetry or consonance, where a lot of things are going on in your brain, and you're kind of some people describe it as having a lot of gear mechanisms perfectly shift gears onto each other and like never collide in any unpleasant way, except when you're coming down, where in a sense the whole thing is still moving very fast, but there's no central organizing principle, so the whole thing may break down in very unpleasant ways. Also explains to a large extent why stimulant calm down, so to speak, happens way earlier than when the person feels lethargic, when the drug doesn't have any effect anymore and they're kind of feeling the reverse of the state. No. The stimulant calm down, so to speak, usually happens when the person is still quite a bit stimulated. It's just that it's an unpleasant, dysphoric type of stimulation. And again, I would ask you, if you happen to be in that situation at some point, to introspect on perhaps that might be related to some kind of high-frequency dissonance we might say or suspect, in the connectum-specific harmonic waves. But we can talk about it even just phenomenologically, this kind of like sense of many multiple clocks being out of whack when you're in a dysphoric stimulant state like that. Then there's also the whole space of pain phenomenology. The McGill pain index, has like 50 different types of pain, shearing and burning and pinching and impaling. There's like all of these different varieties, and you can think of all of them as really like these structurally dissonant patterns. It just, there's many ways in which something can be asymmetrical in that way, and different varieties of pain and misery could be, in a sense, explained as almost kind of like in a table of fundamental types of pain as the different possible symmetry breaking operations that may be going on in your experiential field. Now, there's also, fascinating other pieces of evidence like strobes, when you get, stroboscopically stimulated in 4 hertz or 10 hertz, one of those interesting frequencies that cause hallucinations or mood effects. Again, why would an extremely simple pattern of stimulation generate something that is so valenced? It has such a heavy emotional component. Now, in a sense, you may think, well, I've seen strobes. That's not really the case. But let me tell you, the strobes that you experienced probably were just not bright enough for this effect to happen. You really need very, very bright strobes. And the reason is that your brain is constantly trying to compensate for the things that it can predict. So in a sense, as I was describing with music, you need to, it's not only about providing a repeating pattern, but it's a repeating, symmetrical, smooth, unexpected pattern that really kind of crosses the guards of your brain before it, that gets inhibited, because it's something your brain recognizes as being able to fully predict, so it doesn't fully engage with it. With very intense strobe lights, you can overcome that resistance, and yeah, it's very powerful mood effects. I mean, people compare 4 hertz intense stroboscopic stimulation as, sharing maybe up to 60% of the effects of something like psilocybin. I mean, the only thing that is not shared between those types of experiences is time dilation. But, intensified emotion, recall of emotionally meaningful childhood memories and so on, all of those appear in intense stroboscopic stimulation. Again, something that would be very surprising unless you have a theory that connects valence and symmetry in one way or another. Now, I'm just going to, there's like a lot more I could talk about, and I'm going to be writing a lot more about these in the near future, but just to kind of like give you a little bit also of third-person data. I mean, a researcher in Mexico conducting EEG measurements of 5-MeO-DMT, which, for those who don't know it, is probably the most intense, emotionally at least intense psychedelic. He found, as expected, the alpha and beta region of the EEG spectrum significantly dropped in power, which is something that is seen, with other psychedelics, regular DMT, LSD, and so on. And gamma, which is associated with heightened states of consciousness, increased dramatically in power. Now, the thing that is actually fascinating about this is not that, because that is expected. The thing that is really unexpected is that gamma coherence increased as well. That is, the correlation between the different channels across the brain becomes really, 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 really high on that state. And you can think of it, there's probably some resonant modes in the brain that are like massively simplified, so the signal is very easy to read because there's not all of these, orchestra and of different frequencies and overlapping ways, just a relatively simple pattern. And because they're in a state of coherence, you can infer that that's a whole brain state. And that is, in a sense, an indication of significantly increased symmetry in the overall brain state, especially in light of something connecting specific harmonic waves. I would like to address, though, there are these fascinating findings, including some by Robin Carhart-Harris and others in his lab, but a lot of people have been figuring this out, which is that psychedelics in EEG also increases signal diversity, which you can estimate by seeing how difficult it is to compress the EEG signal. And in a sense, this perhaps would seem to go counter with the symmetry theory of valence, because difficulty compressing a signal is indicating that there's no simple underlying pattern that is generating it. But I would think actually you can very much like square the overall theory with this. There are two key things. One is like the window in which you're computing the signal diversity, because if you experience a highly symmetrical, highly valenced state, the window that matters is really only the one where you're experiencing that state, or a very similar, or being within an attractor of that particular state. If you take the entire recording, then no, like that's not necessarily going to fly. But then the other critical thing is controlling for amount of consciousness. And psychedelics seem to increase the amount of consciousness that you have. I mean, a simple proxy for this is basically thinking of your experience in kind of a pixelated way, and kind of like counting all of the just noticeable differences present in it. And on a psychedelic, not only do you experience these weird, complex geometrical and symmetry effects, but also there's just way more consciousness. So really, when it comes to deciding kind of like the overall valence of the state, we need to control by the amount of consciousness too. And that's something that we currently cannot really, easily determine, but it's something that we can ask participants, including, along asking about their valence. Yeah, I mean, just kind of something that you may find perhaps funny, but I think it's some type of evidence is linguistic evidence. I mean, in a sense, it's fascinating how a lot of negative words, at least in English, are associated with symmetry breaking operations, right? You're saying, I'm screwed, or you say, that man is twisted, that person, it's out of whack, or there's like a lot of expressions like that, as opposed to, for example, like I really feel harmony with that person, or I experience a sense of balance, all these words that are also, pointing towards symmetry. And it would make sense, especially when you consider it in light of something like the homeostatic symmetry, the symmetry theory of homeostatic regulation. To feel balance is a sign of health to a large extent, and feeling screwed or twisted is a sign of something really, really troublesome happening in your experiential field, perhaps an indication of disease of some sort. And I would also kind of point at the phenomenology of things like psychedelics and DMT or dissociatives, or where, in a sense, there is apparently this intrinsic phenomenological correlation between being in these balanced harmonic attractors and feeling, in a sense, better than well, as opposed to being in these kind of incongruent worlds where you have two types of resonance that are incompatible with each other, both battling to kind of overtake your mind, which people have described with things like DMT. And that's exactly what the symmetry theory of valence would predict, that there would be a very strong association between whether there's a global balanced state where you can, in a sense, rest your attention, or if there's this jittering, discordant state between different subcomponents of your experience. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot more I could talk about. I'm just going to say one more thing, which is this theory also explains why the pleasure centers are where they are, which is very close to the functional center of the brain, somewhat in the center geometrically, but even more so when you take into account the connectome. And you would, in a sense, you can figure out that something that is extremely central to a large network that can have resonant modes, as in the spectral analysis of the Laplacian of the network. The central locations would be excellent places to have kind of a tuning knob for the overall symmetry and harmony of the entire graph. In a sense, it doesn't really matter that the pleasure centers themselves are active. What matters is that they're gating and controlling large-scale consonants, symmetry in the entire brain. And one fascinating prediction that this makes is that it suggests that, on the one hand, if you externally stimulate the brain with, let's say, something like the God helmet, perhaps with higher power, but electromagnetic gamma range frequencies that are highly consonant, that is going to feel really good, even if it's not activating your pleasure centers, and even if it's not raising the amount of dopamine or serotonin and endorphins, which would dissociate in that way. But to doubly dissociate it, we can do the opposite, which is look at what happens if you elevate serotonin and dopamine and endorphins, and you activate the pleasure centers, but you suppress the large-scale symmetry and harmony that results usually from activating the pleasure centers. And the theory he would predict that even though in that case the pleasure centers are fully active, that it's still not going to feel good, because the key thing that is making it feel good is the large-scale synchrony as a result. So I'm just going to conclude with that. Just want to let you know there's a lot more from where this came from, and the first time I heard about the Symmetry Theory of Valence from Mike, I was intrigued but extremely skeptical. Now, more than 5 years later, after aggregating all this evidence and applying it in many different situations, I would say there's a very big chance. There's a very good chance, at least personally, I might put it in the 95 to 99% probability, and I think it will be pretty important if we either discredit it or we confirm it. Either way, it's going to be very interesting. All right, well, with that, thank you very much for listening, and see you next time.